Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are diving into the absolutely incredible and honestly highly unexpected origin story of a true global automotive legend. You know, when we hear the name Skyline GT-R, our minds probably jump straight to the modern legends, right? We're picturing the R32, the R33, the R34. We're thinking of advanced engineering, massive horsepower, and just pure racing domination. But the story of this iconic Japanese performance car, well, it actually didn't start out that way at all. So we're going to trace its roots all the way back to a surprisingly humble beginning that, quite frankly, most people completely overlook. So, let's challenge everything you might assume about the history of this modern supercar killer. I mean, imagine a car that started its life as just an ordinary Japanese family sedan. It's almost hard to wrap your head around, isn't it? The Skyline was never originally designed to go out and hunt down Ferraris. It wasn't built to dominate international racing circuits, and it certainly wasn't meant to become the ultimate poster car for an entire generation of gearheads. It was, quite simply, an automobile designed for practical, everyday transportation, getting from A to B.
But the car's early journey is just fascinating. Taking a look at this timeline, you'll see the Skyline name first appeared in the late 1950s. But get this, it wasn't even a Nissan. It was actually introduced by the Prince Motor Company. And throughout the late 50s, it just remained a basic passenger car. But then, as we move into the early 1960s, Prince began experimenting. They kind of realized that motorsport could really elevate the reputation of their everyday cars. So they started developing higher performance versions of the Skyline. And that set the stage for a massive turning point in 1964, which ultimately led to a huge corporate merger with Nissan in 1966.
Now, everything literally changed at the 1964 Second Japan Grand Prix. The Prince Motor Company made this incredibly bold decision to enter the Skyline into the race. Now keep in mind, they were essentially putting up their modified family sedan against much more powerful, purpose-built racing machinery. Honestly, most spectators probably didn't give the Skyline a second thought. But then something totally unexpected happened. The Skyline performed incredibly well. It absolutely shocked the crowds and completely shattered everyone's expectations by holding its own against the absolute giants of the track. So what does this all mean? Well, that single 1964 race created something entirely new. It forged a true performance identity. This totally unexpected motorsport success permanently embedded itself into the Skyline's DNA. From that day on, it was no longer just a reliable way to get groceries, it was a proven competitor. And when the Prince Motor Company merged with Nissan just 2 years later in 1966, well, the Skyline name proudly survived. But more importantly, Nissan had just acquired a platform with a rapidly growing, highly respected performance reputation. Which brings us to the birth of a legend, the 1969 Nissan Skyline GT-R. By this point, Nissan was totally ready to leverage that newly acquired racing DNA, and the result was, without a doubt, historic. Just look at this comparison. The contrast is massive. On one side, we've got the practical family passenger car from the late 50s, and on the other, the aggressive 1969 GT-R. This new vehicle was fundamentally different. It was engineered from the ground up for pure motorsport. You see, Nissan wanted to prove to the entire world that a Japanese manufacturer could engineer a car capable of competing head-to-head with the most established, prestigious performance brands on the planet. And the GT-R? That was their weapon of choice. Now I want you to check out this number, 160. So what makes this figure so special? Well, tucked under the hood of that 1969 GT-R was the legendary S20 engine. This was a 2.0-liter inline-six that was incredibly closely related to the cutting-edge technology Nissan was using in their dedicated racing machinery at the time. It featured a super sophisticated multi-valve cylinder head and dual overhead camshafts. Now sure, pumping out around 160 horsepower might not sound earth-shattering today, but for its era, that was an incredibly impressive figure. It firmly established the GT-R as a very serious mechanical threat. But, you know, horsepower alone doesn't build a legend. Unlike the cars we see today, the first-generation GT-R didn't have a massive turbocharger. It had no computer-controlled all-wheel drive system, no sophisticated traction control. In fact, it had a complete lack of the electronic aids we've come to rely on. Instead, it dominated Japanese touring car racing through pure, unadulterated mechanical engineering, careful chassis development, and just raw driver skill. It accumulated an unbelievable number of victories, cementing a reputation for absolute domination that Nissan simply couldn't have bought with any advertising campaign. But then, we hit the end of an era with the 1973 KPGC 110. Literally, just as the GT-R was riding the absolute highest wave of motorsport success, everything suddenly changed. As you can see here, external forces completely derailed the momentum of this new GT-R. The automotive industry suddenly entered a deeply difficult period. Much stricter emissions regulations created enormous engineering hurdles, which basically made the high-performance S20 engine totally unviable. Combine that with rapidly shifting market conditions, and Nissan was forced to drastically limit production. The result? Well, the 1973 GT-R was produced in extremely small numbers, ultimately making it just a fleeting shadow of what it was really supposed to be. And the fallout from those challenges was absolute. Following that incredibly short-lived 1973 run, the unthinkable happened. The GT-R badge disappeared entirely. For more than a decade, not a single new Skyline GT-R rolled off the production line. Now, while the standard Nissan Skyline continued to evolve as a regular model throughout the 1970s and 80s, the highest performance, race-dominating badge that had absolutely shocked the world, it simply vanished from the automotive landscape.
With the legendary GT-R name completely absent throughout the remainder of the 70s and well into the 80s, a lot of enthusiasts naturally assumed the legend was dead. They thought the 1969 and 1973 models were just a brief, glorious flash in the pan that we'd simply never see again. So, that leaves us with a huge question. Was the story really over?
Well, while the public thought the GT-R was dead and gone, Nissan was actually quietly biding its time. Behind the scenes, automotive technology was rapidly changing. Turbocharging was becoming incredibly important for producing massive power. Electronic engine management systems were seeing huge improvements, which allowed for the kind of precision control that the original, purely mechanical GT-R never had. And across the board, Japanese manufacturers were becoming fiercely competitive on a global scale. Nissan was watching, they were learning, and they were developing a completely new generation of Skyline in the shadows.
Because this next chapter would completely transform the Skyline from a Japanese performance car into an absolute technological monster. When the GT-R badge finally returned, it wasn't just a continuation of the past. It was a total revolution.
We're looking at the incredible evolution of the Nissan Skyline GT-R. Think about this. We are going to explore exactly how a relatively normal, everyday Japanese passenger car was meticulously engineered into a completely unstoppable, mythical racing monster. A machine that literally disrupted the entire global hierarchy of performance cars. If you are even slightly into engineering, motorsport, or car culture in general, you are absolutely going to love this one.
But before we get into all the mechanical nuts and bolts, we really have to start right here with just a single word: Godzilla. Now, that is a terrifying nickname, right? I mean, it immediately conjures up this image of an unstoppable, giant monster just destroying everything in its path. And honestly, that is exactly what this car was doing on the Australian racing circuits back in the early 1990s. The motorsport community down there didn't just respect this machine. They were literally terrified of it. It was so completely devastating and dominant on the track that they gave it this monstrous nickname. So how on earth did a car earn a title like that?
Well, here is our chronological roadmap for this explainer. We're going to track a super rapid 3-generation technological evolution, starting with the R32 in 1989, moving to the R33 in 1995, and finishing up with the R34 in 1999.
Part 1, the birth of Godzilla, the R32 revolution. Let's get into it.
So, by the late 1980s, Nissan didn't just want the Skyline to be another quick sedan. No. They had a way more aggressive goal. They wanted to build a machine engineered specifically to absolutely dominate motorsport. And to pull off this massive technological leap, they created what enthusiasts consider a holy trinity of engineering. We're talking about the ATTESA E-TS all-wheel drive system, the super HICAS four-wheel steering, and of course, the legendary RB26 DETT twin-turbo engine. Putting these three things together gave the car completely insane traction, razor-sharp cornering, and just massive, massive power.
Now that ATTESA system is really what made this car feel like a glitch in the Matrix. It wasn't your basic old-school all-wheel drive that just locks power 50-50 to the front and back. It was this hyper-intelligent system that could dynamically distribute torque between the front and rear wheels exactly when and where it was needed. Basically, this let the R32 grip the tarmac and exit corners in a way that its rear-wheel drive competitors simply could not match. And sitting under the hood was the absolute heart of this beast, the 2.6-liter twin-turbo inline-six, the RB26. Now, officially, if you looked at the spec sheet in Japan, Nissan claimed it made about 280 horsepower. But you have to know, this was basically due to a voluntary gentleman's agreement between Japanese automakers at the time to cap horsepower claims. The actual reality? The true potential was huge. Tuners figured out real quick that the RB26 had a practically bulletproof bottom end. It could handle crazy amounts of boost, and those twin turbos gave you the flexibility to easily unlock unbelievable supercar-level power. But Nissan didn't build this thing just so guys could tune it in their garages. They built it to go racing. When the R32 GT-R showed up in Group A touring car racing in Australia, the competition was already really fierce. But the GT-R, it was virtually unbeatable. That mix of grip, power, and reliability just made it a weapon. It wasn't just winning races, it was embarrassing the competition. And that specific era of dominance is exactly what birthed the Godzilla nickname. Obviously, street enthusiasts saw this and immediately started copying the race cars, swapping in bigger turbos, upgrading the fuel systems, dialing in the suspension. The R32 completely morphed from just a car into a definitive tuning platform.
Which brings us to Section 2, Conquering the Green Hell, the R33 Evolution. Fast forward a bit to 1995. The whole world is busy hacking and modifying the R32, but Nissan's engineers are in the lab building its successor. Now, when the R33 Skyline GT-R dropped, it really looked more like an evolution than a total revolution. It was slightly larger, it focused heavily on high-speed stability, and it had a much more aerodynamically refined body. The big takeaway here is that they kept the exact same winning DNA, the RB26, the ATTESA all-wheel drive, the super HICAS steering, but they smoothed out the rough edges. They basically refined the whole package to make it a much more stable, planted machine when pushed to its absolute limits. And all of that obsessive refinement paid off with this number right here, 8 minutes. See, the R33 took on the legendary Nürburgring Nordschleife over in Germany, the Green Hell. It's widely considered the most brutal, unforgiving track on the planet. Insane elevation changes, blind corners, huge straights. The R33 GT-R became one of the very first production cars to ever run a lap there in under 8 minutes. Doing that essentially proved to the entire world, without a shadow of a doubt, that this Japanese coupe was a world-class giant-slaying performance machine.
All right, Section 3, the ultimate Skyline, the R34 era. It's 1999, and the R34 arrives. This is it. This is the car that took literally everything Nissan had learned over the last decade and smashed it together into a vehicle that would go on to define an entire generation. Mechanically, you still had that same legendary heartbeat, the RB26, ATTESA HICAS. But the R34 brought the driving experience into the future. Take a look at this multifunction display right in the center console. For the late 90s, this was basically alien technology. It showed the driver live telemetry, boost pressure, oil temp, water temp, throttle position. Sitting in that seat with all that data glowing at you, you genuinely felt like you were flying a race car, not driving to the grocery store. And on the outside, the R34 looked incredibly mean. It was way more muscular and chiseled than the R33, shorter overhangs, super sharp lines, a massive wing on the back, and those totally iconic glowing round taillights. Honestly, it looked exactly like a track car that had somehow just escaped onto public streets. And, considering tuners were routinely pushing that RB26 to double or triple its factory horsepower, it definitely drove like one too.
Section 4. A global automotive phenomenon. The Skyline goes viral. So this is where we have to shift gears a bit. We're moving from the mechanical engineering side to the massive cultural impact, because the Skyline GT-R transcended car culture entirely. It went mainstream. How? Well, it started with video games and driving simulators. Millions of kids and adults around the world were suddenly experiencing the power and handling of a GT-R from their living rooms. Then came global blockbuster movies, putting the R34 front and center on the big screen. Add in the early days of internet car forums where people were sharing these insane 1,000 horsepower builds, and boom, the Skyline wasn't just a fast Japanese car anymore. It was literally the global poster child for modern automotive engineering. But that brings up a really fascinating question. If it was so famous, why was the Skyline viewed as this incredibly mysterious, almost untouchable myth by American car enthusiasts? Why did it feel like a unicorn? Well, the answer is right here. The Skyline GT-R was never, ever officially sold in the United States during its original production run. Just think about how crazy that is. American fans were driving it in video games, they were reading about it in magazines, they were watching it in huge Hollywood movies, but they literally could not walk into a Nissan dealership and buy one. It was the ultimate forbidden fruit. And that massive unavailability just threw gasoline on the fire. It created this intense international obsession, making the R34 one of the most coveted, highly valued modern classics on the planet today. But as with all great things, the story of this specific era eventually had to come to a close. Following the legendary R34, Nissan was preparing for a brand new chapter. They made the super bold decision to finally move beyond the Skyline name for their flagship performance car.
The Skyline GT-R era, as the world knew it, was done. The GT-R badge was getting ready to evolve into its own completely standalone model. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought. As Nissan officially separated the GT-R from the Skyline family to build a totally standalone supercar, could anything ever truly replace the original Godzilla? The R32, R33, and R34, they didn't just break lap records, they completely broke the mold of what a performance car was even supposed to be. They left behind a legacy that is still fueling an intense, worldwide obsession to this very day.
We're talking about a machine that completely rewired how the world views performance cars. Just picture it, a humble, totally ordinary Japanese passenger car, basically built for getting groceries, that somehow evolved, decade after decade, into a world-dominating, physics-defying monster that literally made Ferrari and Porsche engineers sweat. It's not just a story about horsepower, you know? It's this incredible, wild saga of relentless engineering, total motorsport dominance, and a massive cultural impact. There's actually a saying in the car world that hits the nail on the head for this one. A car that began as a Japanese family sedan eventually became one of the most famous performance cars on Earth. Sounds almost made up, right? But that's exactly what makes the Skyline GT-R story so insanely captivating. We're going to trace this incredible 6-decade evolutionary journey together. We'll see exactly how this car morphed from the gritty, pure mechanical engineering of its early days into the hyper-advanced, computer-driven masterpiece we know today.
Part 1. Origins of a Legend. To really understand the DNA of this car, we gotta rewind to the very beginning.
So to get the whole GT-R picture, we actually have to look all the way back to the late 1950s. The journey kicked off with the Prince Motor Company, and they originally developed the Skyline as a luxury car. But everything totally shifted in 1966 when Prince merged with Nissan. And under Nissan, in 1969, absolute magic happened. The birth of the very first Nissan Skyline GT-R. It was rocking that legendary S20 inline-six engine, and it just immediately dominated Japanese motorsport. But man, this golden dawn was pretty brief. They rolled out a second-generation GT-R in 1973, but it slammed right into a brick wall, the global oil crisis and strict new emissions regulations. Production was just abruptly halted. The GT-R badge actually vanished for 16 long years, leaving fans seriously wondering if the legend was just dead forever.
Part 2, the Golden JDM era. Now this is the era that the purists out there consider the absolute peak of the mountain.
Fast forward to 1989, and the GT-R makes this triumphant return with the R32, which then evolved into the R33, and eventually the totally iconic R34. Now, these generations didn't just bring face-melting performance. They brought an undeniable visual identity. You didn't even need to be a mechanic to get it. You didn't have to know how the advanced all-wheel drive system, ATTESA, worked, or understand the high-tech Super HICAS' four-wheel steering keeping it glued to the tarmac. You just needed to see that silhouette. The second you spotted those four round taillights glowing in the dark, that massive rear wing, and that aggressive squared-off front end, you knew exactly what was pulling up next to you.
Which brings us to a really massive question. Why did this particular car become so important? I mean, think about it. There were plenty of other cars out there pushing more horsepower. There were cars that were faster in a straight line for sure, and definitely exclusive European sports cars that cost way, way more. So why did the Skyline GT-R become the defining legend for so many of us?
Well, the legend wasn't built on just one thing. It was a perfect storm. First off, absolute motorsport dominance. The R32 just decimated the competition in Australian touring car racing, which, by the way, is exactly where that terrifying nickname Godzilla was born. Then you had the R33 breaking production car records at the absolutely grueling Nürburgring. It was this brilliant engineering meeting the insane tuning potential of that twin-turbo engine, and crucially, pop culture. This car exploded into a global phenomenon because it was the ultimate hero car. You drove it in video games like Gran Turismo. You saw it dominating massive movie screens in the Fast and Furious franchise. It became the ultimate, undisputed symbol of what Japanese performance engineering could really do.
But, all golden eras eventually hit a turning point. And for the Skyline GT-R, that point came in 2002. Tighter emissions regulations and a super rapidly changing auto industry basically forced Nissan's hand, and production of the R34 officially ended. For the global enthusiast community, man, this was devastating. It really felt like the definitive end of an era. That beloved RB26 engine was gone. The Skyline GT-R nameplate was gone. And honestly, worse yet, there was no immediate replacement in sight. The king had basically vacated the throne, and it left this massive void in the car world.
Part 3, the Godzilla Reborn. But Nissan wasn't giving up. They were just quietly preparing for a massive technological leap.
5 long years later, in 2007, that silence was finally broken. But Nissan made a pretty revolutionary call here. Instead of just rolling out another Skyline GT-R, they separated the GT-R name entirely. This new car was no longer a Skyline. It was unveiled as a completely standalone, bespoke model, what we know internally as the R35. So the Skyline moniker was dropped, but that core philosophy of extreme, boundary-pushing performance was cranked up to a level literally nobody was fully prepared for.
This move was a massive philosophical shift. Those early 90s cars, they were these gritty, tactile masterpieces of mechanical engineering. Super raw. But the R35, it was a digital supercar built for a digital age. It relied heavily on these vast networks of computers, thousands of sensors, insanely complex electronics, and advanced control systems. But here's the kicker. Underneath all that revolutionary tech beat the exact same heart. It was still driven by that pure, unadulterated desire to give the driver absolutely extraordinary, world-beating performance.
To pull that off, the R35 needed a completely new power plant. So out goes the legendary inline-six, and in comes the VR38 DET. This was a 3.8-liter twin-turbocharged V6, and it marked a monumental shift for the brand. But Nissan absolutely did not cut any corners here. This new engine was purpose-built for relentless high performance. In fact, every single one of these engines is meticulously hand-assembled in a clean room by a master craftsman over in Japan known as Takumi. It's just this incredible fusion of high technology and traditional, hands-on human artistry.
And the engineering definitely didn't stop in the engine bay. To make the R35 handle like a dream, Nissan's engineers made some really radical choices. They took the heavy transmission and tossed it in the rear of the vehicle. This balanced the car's weight distribution almost perfectly, kind of like a giant seesaw. Plus, that transmission was a lightning-fast dual-clutch system that let the car shift way faster than humanly possible. Pair all that with a mind-bendingly advanced all-wheel drive system that calculates traction in milliseconds, and the R35 could launch from a standstill with this astonishing, physics-defying force.
The result of all this wild engineering on the global stage was just earth-shattering. The R35 was fast, sure, but more importantly, it absolutely destroyed the traditional relationship between price and performance. You had a car costing a fraction of what those elite European supercars cost, yet it was consistently challenging and often beating them in 0 to 60 times and around famous racetracks all over the world. This incredible feat rightfully earned the R35 the ultimate title, the supercar killer. That monstrous nickname, Godzilla, born decades earlier on the track, had been powerfully, definitively reawakened. Part 4. A global automotive legacy. Today, the impact of this incredible lineage stretches so far beyond just spec sheets. So while the R35 was out there continuing to evolve, something super fascinating started happening to the older generations. The R32, R33, and especially the R34, they became incredibly sought-after collectible icons. Values began to absolutely skyrocket. A huge part of this was driven by strict import laws, like the 25-year rule in the US, which basically created a massive bottleneck of pent-up demand. As soon as these cars became legal to import, prices for pristine R34s shot up into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Owning a GT-R wasn't just about having a fast car anymore, It became about owning a highly coveted piece of automotive history. But honestly, perhaps the GT-R's greatest achievement isn't a lap record or a crazy auction price. It's the profound way it inspired an entire generation. It inspired everyday enthusiasts to actually pop the hood and learn. It taught a whole generation how turbochargers spool, how aerodynamics keep a car planted, how all-wheel drive manipulates physics, and the intricate, sometimes maddening art of engine tuning. For countless people, this was their very first dream car. It served as a gateway into a lifelong passion for automotive engineering. It all ultimately comes down to this. The Nissan Skyline GT-R didn't just become a Japanese automotive legend. It became a global one. It's this incredible story of how engineering excellence, a totally relentless pursuit of speed, and a passionate tuning culture completely transcended borders. It captivated the entire globe, proving once and for all that unparalleled greatness can evolve from the most humble of beginnings. Decades after that very first GT-R rolled onto a track, people are still restoring them, they're still racing them, and they are definitely still dreaming about them. The fascination hasn't faded even a little bit. If anything, it's only grown stronger. The legend of Godzilla continues to echo through the automotive world. And as technology pushes us into new, totally uncharted territories, stuff like electrification and AI, we really have to ask ourselves, what will this legendary lineage inspire next?